Hello there, Richard Westwood here from St Anne's Church in Chasetown with a midweek message for Wednesday the 5th of November 2025. Our midweek messages at the moment are investigating the letter to the Hebrews, one of the letters in the New Testament of the Bible. And the letter to the Hebrews was written to a group of people who'd become Christians from a Jewish background. And they were facing some difficulties because some of the folk who were previously part of their faith community were encouraging them to move back to the Jewish faith more fully. So part of the thing we have to do in looking through the book of the Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews, is to remember that in all the different things that we read, they're all written with this sense of pressure and difficulty for the Christians who are receiving the letter. That's why we've called these midweek messages Faith Under Fire. And although the pressures that we might face are of a different scale and a different nature, we can still draw encouragement and good teaching from the letter that's written to them. Hebrews chapter 3 immediately follows on from some important teaching at the back end of Hebrews chapter 2. So in this little reading now, I'm going to start reading from Hebrews chapter 2 verse 17 and then read to the end of chapter 2 before reading verses 1 to 6 of chapter 3. So Hebrews chapter 2 verse 17 begins like this. For this reason, he, Jesus, had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And then chapter 3 begins, Therefore, holy brothers and sisters, who share in their heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honour than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honour than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future. But Christ is faithful as the Son over God's house. And we are his house, if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope in which we glory. The rest of chapter 3 goes on to talk about warnings about going back, and that's explored a little bit further in chapter 4. So I'm not going to go into those sections yet, but I would like us to share some of the details that we have in these verses that I've just read. So here at the start of chapter 3, it begins with a therefore, and I was always taught when you in the Bible, when you come across a therefore, you have to remember what the therefore is there for. And it really, that's the reason I read these few verses from the end of chapter 2, because the writer is trying to make sure that the people who are reading his letter know that Jesus is the one who helps us when we're tempted. Because he also faced pressures and temptations, he knows what it feels like. Because Jesus was a human being, he knows the pressures and strains of human life. Therefore, the writer goes on to say, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus. And he goes on to say, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. Two different roles there that he's highlighting. The high priest bit he's going to expand on a little bit later in chapters which are to come later on in the letter to the Hebrews. So I'll just park that for one side for a moment, if that's okay. The high priest is the role that would have been fulfilled by one of the Jewish leaders, fulfilling some of the roles of connecting the people to God. There would often be sacrifices and prayers involved, but the high priest's role was about being with God for the people and connecting them to them. But that's a role we'll explore later in some of our future midweek messages. The other bit that the writer here mentions is about the apostle. And the apostle's normally referred to in the New Testament as being one of the first 12 disciples, followers of Jesus, and then adding on Paul as a later apostle, people who were sort of I'm going to use the wrong phrase, founding fathers, but there were certainly some of the founders, the ones who helped to establish the church and helped in its early teaching. Pioneers, starters, leaders, founders is the word that you might also put alongside that word apostle. So it's an interesting choice of word, because I suppose people from a Jewish background would say, well, one of the apostles or pioneers, the starters of the Jewish faith as they would have experienced it, would be Moses. Moses is the one who received the law. Moses is the one they would have understood to have been the person who wrote down the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those were all understood to be written by Moses. And certainly the big story of the escape from Egypt, the Exodus, where Moses was in charge under God's authority of the people of Israel as they travelled through the wilderness, entering the promised land. All that is part of the story of Moses. So I guess people from a Jewish background would say, well, yeah, Moses is the one who we would look to as the one who's been the trailblazer, the torchbearer, the apostle, you might say. And yet here the writer to the Hebrews says, we are acknowledging Jesus as our high priest and apostle. He expands a little bit more and says Moses was one who was faithful, and Jesus was faithful. That's what he says in verse 2. Both Moses and Jesus were faithful. But he then goes on to say in verse 5, Moses was a faithful servant in God's house, but Jesus is a faithful son. And he goes on also to say that Jesus is much more like the builder of the house, not the house itself. The writer's saying something really significant here, because he's explaining that however respectful his hearers and readers would be of Moses and the heritage that they'd received from him, this was a formulation, this was a way of being that they would have been used to. And the writer's saying, yes, but Jesus is the one who's even greater. He's the one who was the orchestrator, if you like, of the means by which Moses was able to bring God's people out of Egypt under slavery and into the promised land. Jesus is behind all the ways that you've known of how you connect with God, he's saying, I believe. Paraphrasing a little, I hope I'm not taking liberties, but if we're to understand that this approach that the people who were from a Jewish background were used to, that of being within the Jewish faith, the writer here to the letter to the Hebrews is saying Jesus is behind, he's the orchestrator, the author, if you like, of the formulation that you've known. So if you think the formulation was good, then Jesus is greater even than that, because he's the one who enabled this means that you've known of being set up. This means that you have of being known by God and knowing God. That was the way that Jesus was authoring, if you like, that approach to God. Bringing it a bit more up to date, I suppose you could say, if any of us are hungry for God, if any of us have a sense of God stirring us and wanting us to know God, those are the emotions, feelings and thoughts that we have. And borrowing these ideas from the letter to the Hebrews, we might say, well, we feel those feelings, we think those thoughts, but Jesus is the one who's behind those feelings and thoughts. He's the one who's creating in us a hunger for God, and he is the one who will also satisfy that hunger for God too. Whatever our hunger for God is, Jesus is the one who we will find will satisfy that hunger best and most, because he is the one who's creating the hunger that he knows we need in order to receive him. A prayer. Lord, make me hungry for you. Make us hungry for you, Lord. And then fill us, Lord, with your good self. We believe, Lord, that you are the one who knows all the challenges that we face in life. You know our ups and downs and our struggles, and you show us the way. You are the one we want to have our eyes fixed on. You're the one we want to think about and follow. So stir up in us, Lord, a hunger for you, please, and then fulfill us with your own true self. We ask this in and because of your love for us, Jesus. Amen. Thanks for listening. Take care and God bless. Bye-bye.